At the end of Resident Evil 8, we see Rose Winters get picked up by an agent. However, Chris and his Houndwolf squad are nowhere to be seen. And this kind of has me wondering, is it possible that Chris, during this point in time, which takes place in the year 2037, could Chris have retired from the front lines and instead has taken sort of a back seat as the new director of the BSAA? And if so, could we actually see that be sort of the plot point to Resident Evil 9, should it actually follow through with the cliffhanger that Resident Evil 8 gave us, where Chris orders his team to go to the BSAA in Europe and see if they can figure out why it is they're using bioweapons? I think that is a possible thing that could end up happening, because after all, Resident Evil 6 did originally tease the idea of him retiring and having Pierce sort of take over afterwards. They ended up throwing that concept away and having Pierce sacrifice himself and Chris move on. But could they sort of be resurfacing back to that sort of plot line? And this time, instead of Chris sacrificing himself and dying, like in the original concept for Resident Evil 6, what if instead he retires at the end of Resident Evil 9 from the front lines, so he's not doing combat anymore, but he's still active as the new director behind the scenes? I think something like that could very well happen. And there are a few ways in which I could see something like that happening. The first one would be that maybe during Resident Evil 9, on their mission, Chris ends up losing all of his teammates from the Houndwolf squad, so everyone ends up getting killed, and that would be yet another team that Chris has to sit there and witness getting killed off. And that could be enough to sort of push him over the edge at the end of the game to where he can no longer do it. Like, he mentally can no longer watch another set of teams fall victim to bioterrorism, and so he ends up having to retire from the front lines and become the new director from that standpoint. Another thing that could potentially happen is maybe he does lose his team and he himself also receives an injury to where he is forced to retire from the front lines. Like, he can physically no longer face any bioweapon in combat because of the injury in which he ends up receiving. So instead, he retires from the front lines and he becomes the new director behind the scenes. So something like that could also end up happening as well. So that right there could be an option. Maybe he's like wheelchair bound or something like that. But that is another option. And then something else that I was thinking is that maybe they solve the corruption and everything gets fixed and it's all good. But then Chris decides that in order to ensure corruption no longer infects the BSAA, he is going to step down from the front lines and become the new director himself to ensure that no corruption will ever get involved in the BSAA again under his leadership. So I think something like that could also happen. And then with Jill having the whole slow aging storyline, she could be the one to sort of replace Chris on the front lines. So I think something like that would be a really interesting concept because, and I think I've mentioned this in other videos before, Chris has been in many games recently, like a lot of games. He's shown up, whether he was the main character or he was behind the scenes like he is in 7 and 8. He has appeared in several games lately, whereas Jill hasn't really had any screen time at all. Since Resident Evil 5, she hasn't really done much. She's gotten a remake and she got one movie. That's all she's had so far. So it could be that after 9, Chris and Jill's roles sort of reverse and Chris takes a backseat behind the scenes as the new director, while Jill becomes the new frontlines character for the BSAA. So any game involving the BSAA, Jill is going to be our main character moving forward instead of Chris. So I think something like that would be really cool. And I think a lot of fans would really be open for something like that because Jill is one of the characters that fans have been wanting to see return in the games for so long. So I think if they were to do something like that and have Chris and Jill's roles sort of reverse, I think people would be all in favor for that. Now, if they were to do that, I think 9 needs to have Jill show up, even if she's not playable, and work alongside Chris for their last mission together. I think if Chris is going to retire at the end of Resident Evil 9, Jill needs to be by his side throughout that game so that we can have that one last game with those two together, working together on their final mission. So something like that is what I would like to see. But of course, it's also possible that if Resident Evil 9 is to take place around the BSAA plot line, that Chris does not end up retiring at the end of that mission, and instead continues onward for several more missions to come, and instead ends up retiring closer to the events of Shadows of Rose. Maybe he ends up retiring around 2035 or 2036 or something like that, given the fact that around that time he'll be in his 60s. So it could just be a case that by Shadows of Rose, he's just physically too old to really keep up with the advanced bioweapons, and at that point in time, he decides to retire and then become maybe the new director of the BSAA or something like that. So that is a possibility as well. But what do you think? Do you think it's possible that at the end of Resident Evil 9, Chris could actually retire from the front lines, becoming the BSAA's new director, while maybe Jill sort of becomes the new frontline character that we'll play as in future installments that involve the BSAA? Let me know your thoughts on this. Do you want Chris to retire? Would you prefer that he sticks around and continues to show up in more games? Let me know your thoughts. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video here, and I will see you all on the next one. See you then.